She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for a chair. She stood at the far end of the range with her rifle still slung across her back and waited for someone to tell her she was in the wrong place. Nobody did, because nobody had expected her to make it this far. The base at Petawawa sits in the Ottawa Valley, where the Algonquin forest comes right up to the fence line, and the winters arrive without announcement. In November, the ground freezes solid by the third week, and the wind off the river cuts through standard issue gear like it has a personal grievance. The soldiers stationed there called it the Valley. They said it with a particular flatness, the way people name things that have already broken them once. Corporal Vivian Thorne had been assigned to the Valley 18 months earlier, transferred from a reconnaissance unit in Wainwright after a training exercise that her commanding officer described in his report as statistically irregular. That was the phrase he used. Statistically irregular. What he meant was that she had hit 9 consecutive moving targets at 800 meters in a crosswind, using a rifle she had borrowed from a colleague because her own had jammed that morning. What he also meant, though he never wrote this down, was that he didn't know what to do with her. Thorne had a way of solving problems that made people uncomfortable. Not because her solutions were wrong, because they were right in ways that hadn't been considered yet. She was 31 years old. She had dark brown hair she kept in a braid tight enough to stay put through a prone position, and she had the kind of stillness that most people confuse for coldness until they realize it's actually concentration. Her evaluation scores from Wainwright sat in a file somewhere, flagged but not acted on. The military is good at that, flagging things and not acting on them. The range master at Petawawa was a warrant officer named Dalglish. He had been running that range for 11 years and had strong opinions about methodology, about discipline, and about the proper relationship between junior soldiers and people like himself. When Thorne reported to him on her first morning, he looked at her transfer paperwork for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You'll be on maintenance detail this week." Maintenance detail meant cleaning weapons that other people had already cleaned, resetting targets that didn't need resetting, and standing in the cold while the platoon ran drills she wasn't permitted to participate in. It was the kind of assignment that delivers a message without ever stating one directly. Thorne completed every task without complaint and without comment, and at the end of the week she submitted a written request to qualify for the unit's long-range marksmanship certification. Dalglish denied it. He cited incomplete orientation hours. She submitted another request the following week. He denied it again. Administrative backlog. The third request she submitted in writing, with her orientation hours calculated to the minute and attached as a separate document. He held that one for 4 days before calling her into his office. "You seem to think you belong somewhere you don't," he told her. Thorne looked at him the way she looked at targets, without aggression, without nervousness, with the specific quality of attention that takes in every variable. "I'm requesting the opportunity to qualify," she said. "The same opportunity that's available to every member of this unit. The certification process is designed for." "I've read the process, sir. I meet the prerequisites." He told her the certification slot had been filled. She went back to maintenance detail. What Dalglish hadn't considered, and what becomes relevant later, is that Thorne had been keeping records. Not out of calculation, out of habit. She was the kind of person who documented things because documentation was how she thought. She wrote down dates, times, the exact wording of verbal denials when she could remember them. It wasn't a strategy. It was just how her mind organized information, the same way she organized ballistic data, the same way she ran environmental calculations in her head before a shot. She kept a small notebook in her left breast pocket, and she wrote in it every day. Nobody noticed. Nobody thought to notice. The opportunity arrived not because someone finally recognized her ability, but because someone else failed to account for it. In February, the base hosted a joint exercise with 2 other units, a skills assessment that included, among other components, a long-range marksmanship evaluation. The exercise had been organized months in advance by a major named Coots, who ran operational training for the region. It involved 12 participants, all of them male, all of them senior in rank to Thorne. It was not designed with her in mind, but the exercise required a designated spotter for the evaluation component, and the soldier originally assigned, a corporal from Trenton, pulled a tendon in his ankle 2 days before. Dalglish needed a replacement on short notice, and Thorne was the only person available with the correct clearance level. He gave her the assignment without looking at her when he said it. He said, "You'll observe. You won't touch anything unless asked." "Understood," Thorne said. She showed up that morning in the dark, before anyone else had arrived, and set up the spotting scope herself. The range ran 1,100 meters to the far tree line. The morning was clear, but the temperature was -14, and the wind was reading inconsistently off the valley wall, gusting from the northwest in 3-second intervals, then dropping, then shifting to come in from the north-northeast at a slightly different angle. This was the kind of condition that made long-range marksmanship genuinely difficult. The participants would need to account for the shift, and they would need to time their shots. Thorne sat behind the spotting scope and said nothing. The first 6 shooters went through the evaluation with unremarkable results. 2 hit their primary targets. 4 missed the adjustment window and lost points on the wind reading. The range officer called each result, marked his clipboard, moved on. By the 3rd shooter, Thorne had calculated the wind pattern down to a reliable 8-second cycle. The gusts weren't random. They followed the geography of the valley wall, and if you watched the tree line at the far end of the range, you could see the movement 2 seconds before it hit the firing position. She did not share this. It was not her place to share it. She had been told to observe and not touch anything. So she observed and she calculated, and she watched 6 soldiers lose points on a wind pattern she had mapped inside the first 20 minutes. The 7th shooter was a master corporal named Fawcett. He was one of the better marksmen in the unit, technically sound, physically composed. He lay in the prone position, controlled his breathing, and missed his first target by what the range officer called high and left. Wind red. He adjusted, waited, and missed his second target by almost the same margin, this time in the opposite direction, because the wind had shifted back while he was adjusting for the first deviation. Fawcett sat up and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who understood he had just lost something he couldn't recover. The range officer said nothing. That was protocol. Major Coots, who had been standing to the right of the line and watching, turned to Dalglish and said something quiet. Dalglish shook his head. They went through 4 more shooters. 2 more missed the wind cycle. The results by the end of the morning session were below what the exercise had projected. At noon, they broke for a meal and Major Coots called a review. He was not a man who showed frustration openly, but it was present in the way he held his clipboard. Too tight, shifted from hand to hand. He went through the results with the group, asked questions about approach, got answers that were technically correct, but that didn't address the actual problem. Thorne sat at the end of the row. She had not been formally included in the review. Coots looked at her. "You were spotting all morning," he said. "What did you see?" It was a genuine question, the kind a person asks when they've run out of answers from the people they expected to have them. Thorne said, "The wind is cycling off the valley wall. Northwest gust every 8 seconds, then a 2-second drop, then a northeast return at roughly 40% of the original speed. If you watch the upper tree line at the far end, you can see the movement about 2 seconds before it reaches the line. That gives you a 4-second window on the drop where the conditions are consistent enough for the shot." The room was quiet. Fawcett, who had been staring at the table, looked up slowly. Cotts said, "You mapped that this morning?" "During the first session," Thorne said. Dalglish said, from the far end of the table, "She's a spotter. She's not part of the evaluation." "I'm aware of what she is," Couch said, and there was something in his voice that made Dalglish stop talking. The afternoon session ran differently. Cotts asked Thorne to provide wind calls before each shot, not as an official part of the evaluation, which had its own protocol, but as information for the shooters to consider. She did this without ceremony, calling the numbers the same way she would read them off a scope. 3 of the afternoon's 6 shooters hit both targets. The aggregate scores shifted measurably. At the end of the day, Coots reviewed the full results and then asked the group to step out while he spoke to Dalglish and 2 of the other senior NCOs alone. Nobody told Thorne what was said in that room. But 3 days later, a certification slot appeared on the unit schedule with her name beside it. The certification itself was not the problem. The problem began the week after she passed it. The marksmanship certification at Petawawa opened access to a specialized support program, a small team attached to the base that handled long-range reconnaissance coordination. 6 people total, running operations that Thorne didn't have the clearance to know about in detail, but that she understood from context involved extended duration surveillance work in low-visibility environments. The kind of work that required specific technical skills and a particular tolerance for patience. The team's senior member was a sergeant named Okubo. He was methodical, well-regarded, and had been running the program's training component for 3 years. He came to find Thorne after the certification results were posted. "I've seen your file from Wainwright," he said. "I'd like you to run a field evaluation." She said she would. The evaluation involved 2 days in the field in conditions close to what actual deployment would require. Okubo ran it himself with one other member of the team present. Thorne spent 41 hours in a static observation position in temperatures that dropped to -22 overnight, logging target data and relaying calculations without error. On the second morning, Okubo asked her to complete a ballistic adjustment for a non-standard target profile, a calculation that required working through the variables manually under time pressure without the benefit of a preloaded firing solution. She got it right. She got it right in less time than the test parameters assumed was the minimum. Okubo wrote his recommendation that evening. Dalglish filed an objection. This is where things become worth paying attention to, because the objection Dalglish filed was not about Thorne's performance. It was not about her qualifications. It was about what he called integration concerns, a phrase with no formal definition in the unit's documentation, which meant it could mean anything and was very difficult to argue against. He cited the pace of her advancement through certification as irregular. He cited her transfer from Wainwright in language that implied the circumstances were complicated without specifying how. He submitted this objection to the base's administrative review officer with a request to delay the team placement pending further assessment. What Dalglish didn't know, what he had never thought to consider, was that Thorne had documentation of every denied request, every verbal dismissal, every instance in the past 18 months in which she had been assigned to maintenance detail instead of training exercises she was qualified for. She had dates. She had her own written notes on conversations. She had the original transfer paperwork from Wainwright with her evaluation scores attached. She hadn't assembled these things with the intent to use them. She had assembled them because she assembled things. It was the same impulse that made her map a wind pattern. In the first hour of an exercise she wasn't officially part of. She submitted them to Major Coots with a brief cover letter that did not editorialize. It simply presented the timeline and asked that the placement decision be made on the basis of the documented record rather than on the basis of the objection. Coots read everything over 2 evenings. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He was the kind of officer who believed that the purpose of process was to get to the right answer, and that the right answer was usually visible if you were willing to look at all the information instead of the information that confirmed what you already thought. He had been in the military long enough to recognize when a system was being used correctly and when it was being used as a tool for something else. He called Dalglish in and asked him, directly, to walk through the factual basis for the integration concerns. Dalglish cited the pace of advancement. Coots pointed out that the pace had been determined by Thorne filing repeated requests that had been repeatedly denied on administrative grounds, and that when those grounds were examined, they didn't hold. Dalglish said she was difficult. Coots asked him to define difficult. There was a long pause. She asked questions, Dalglish said. About what? About why things are done the way they're done. Coots looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "That's called being a good soldier." Okubo's placement recommendation was approved the following week. Thorne transferred to the team on a Friday morning, carrying her kit and her notebook, which by that point was nearly full. She didn't celebrate. That wasn't her way. But she did stop at the edge of the range on her way across the base. and look at it for a moment. The 1,100 meters of frozen ground, the far tree line, the place where the valley wall sent wind in patterns that most people couldn't read. She had read it the first morning. That had always been the thing Dalglish couldn't account for. Not her ability, her patience with her ability. The willingness to sit quietly in the cold and see what was actually there, instead of what was convenient. Okubo ran the team the way a good NCO runs a team. Clear expectations, shared information, no performance for the sake of it. The other members, Prescott, Lung, Vandekar, Marlowe, took 2 weeks to fully adjust to Thorne's presence, which she understood and did not push against. Integration into a small team takes time and requires trust that has to be earned in specific ways, not assumed. She earned it the way she earned everything, by doing the work. The first operation she was assigned to as a full team member was a joint exercise with a NATO partner unit visiting from Norway. The Norwegians were exceptional at cold weather field work, patient, technically skilled, comfortable with the specific demands of operating in low visibility and low temperature. They arrived at Petawawa with their own equipment and their own protocols, and they ran the joint exercise with the kind of professional efficiency that reminded Thorne of Okubo. On the third day, there was a coordination problem. The exercise scenario required a synchronized action at 2 positions simultaneously, and the timing calculation had been built around conditions that changed overnight, a temperature drop that affected the ballistic data, and a cloud layer that altered the available light at the eastern position. The exercise coordinator, working from the original parameters, didn't catch the discrepancy in time. Thorne caught it. She was not the senior person in the room. She was the newest member of the team. She said, clearly and without apology, that the original timing was wrong by approximately 14 seconds, and that if they ran the scenario as scheduled, the Eastern team would be firing in inadequate light. The exercise coordinator looked at her the way people sometimes look when they are deciding whether to be annoyed or grateful. Okubo said, from the back of the room, run her numbers. They ran her numbers. She was off by 2 seconds, which in the context of the correction she had identified was close enough to matter. The exercise was adjusted. It ran cleanly. That evening, the Norwegian team's senior officer, a captain named Elstad, found Thorne at the edge of the range and told her, without ceremony, that she had good instincts. It's not instincts, she said, it's calculation. Elstad considered this. Yes, he said, but you know when to calculate. That's the part most people can't teach. The review board met in March. It was a standard quarterly review, the kind of process that exists in every institution and that most of the time produces no particular outcome. Kautz attended, so did the base commander, a colonel named Whitmore, so did Dalglish, who had been required to submit a written performance assessment of every soldier under his indirect supervision for the previous year. His assessment of Thorne was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged her technical scores. The second questioned her integration trajectory. The third returned again to the phrase statistically irregular. Whitmore read the 3 paragraphs twice. Then she asked Dalglish what he meant by statistically irregular. He said the results were outliers. She asked if outliers were a problem. He said they created complications in assessment frameworks. She said, Corporal Thorne's scores from Wainwright, her field evaluation results, and her performance in the joint exercise in February, these are all available to this board. Her record as documented by Warrant Officer Dalglish's own unit shows 18 months of successful task completion against a backdrop of repeated administrative delays in her access to training and qualification opportunities. I'd like someone to walk me through what the complication actually is. Nobody walked her through it. There was a silence in the room that had the specific quality of a silence in which everyone is choosing not to say the thing that is obvious. Kautz said quietly, the record is the record. Whitmore looked at the file on the table in front of her. Then she looked up. The record, she said, is exactly what we're looking at, and the record is clear. The review board's recommendations were filed the same day. Thorne's placement with Okubo's team was formalized with a note for her file commending the quality of her documented self-advocacy and the consistency of her performance across environments. The recommendation also included a review of certification access protocols, a systemic adjustment, not targeted at any individual, but addressing the specific pattern of delays that Thorne's documentation had made visible. Dalglish retired from the base 18 months later. He did not make any public comments about the process. He was not asked to. Thorne stayed at Petawawa. She made sergeant the following year. Okubo moved to a training role at Kingston, and she took over the team's long-range coordination function. Not the leadership of the team, which went to Prescott, but the technical component, which was the part that required what she had always been good at. The notebook from her first 18 months at the base she kept. Not as evidence, not as a reminder of what had happened. She kept it because it was full of calculations, wind readings, target data, timing adjustments, and some of the calculations were still useful. She started a new one, same kind, same size, left breast pocket. On the first page, she wrote the date. Then she wrote the wind reading from that morning's conditions. Then she went to work. What happened at Petawawa was not a dramatic reversal. There was no single moment of public vindication, no confrontation in a hallway, no apology given loudly enough for other people to hear. What happened was quieter, and in its own way, more permanent. The documentation existed. The record had been read by the people whose job it was to read it. A soldier who had been assessed as irregular had been seen, finally, as someone who did the math that other people missed, and who had the patience to wait until the math was what the room needed. Thorne never thought of herself as brave in the way people use that word when they mean something explosive. She thought of herself as precise. She thought of herself as someone who measured things carefully and wrote them down, and who trusted that measurement, done honestly and long enough, would eventually speak for itself. In Petawawa, in the cold, beside the range where the valley wall sent wind in patterns nobody else had bothered to map, it did.